to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Leanne and I met at ISCOS in Vancouver, and she also traveled to Vancouver as part of her fellowship that she'll be talking about.
Oh, I didn't make it actually.
Oh, I thought you were over here.
The plan
Yeah.
was, but I can talk about anyway. I ended up
Yeah.
going to Miami because I'd been to Vancouver then for ISCOS. But anyway, I can talk about that.
She'll talk about that. So I'm just going to pass it on over to her.
Thanks, Terry. And nice to meet you, Debbie and Rod. And thanks for the invitation for me to come and have a chat. I am a physiotherapist of nearly 30 years and worked in spinal cord injury for 20. And had the opportunity to work in acute and in rehab and community. And over that time, I started to get an interest around media portrayals of spinal cord injury. Whenever there was a news story of someone who sustained a spinal cord injury, kind of the words and the narrative that would sit around that and the impact it would then have on my patients in rehab, or if there was a story on 60 Minutes about some new treatment that's being offered in Germany, and then family coming in asking whether they can they get that treatment. And so over time, I had this interest and it kind of sat with me. And I then had the opportunity to do a PhD. And I thought, well, let's do it on media and spinal cord injury. And I was really fortunate to get a scholarship to do that. And so I completed that at the end of 2022. So I think that's when ISCOS was on. Is that right, Terry? Was that in 2022?
Yeah.
So that was great. And then at that same time, I applied for a travel fellowship, which my PhD looked at media portrayal, mainly news media here in Australia. But I wanted to get a sense of, well, is this a problem in other countries? So that was the purpose of doing the travel fellowship. I do have a few slides about that travel fellowship, and then it kind of all then leads into the creation of this new illustration, which is really exciting. So does that work, Terry, if I do a couple of slides?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So as I said, my PhD mainly looked at media in the Australian setting, and I did 3 projects as part of my PhD. The first one was I did an analysis of newspaper articles to see how it was that spinal cord injury had been portrayed over time. And that was just in one Australian newspaper. And that paper was published, and that's the Tragedy or Overachievement Media Analysis of Spinal Cord Injury in Australia. And just very quickly, that analysis showed that there are 2 particular narratives or stories that we see, one being of tragedy, and then one being of overachievement, which is mainly dominated by stories who go on to become a Paralympic athlete, go to climb Mount Everest. And so there's either this one or the other kind of storyline. But then I was keen to know, well, how it is that these media portrayals impact people with spinal cord injury. So my second project, I spoke to 24 people with spinal cord injury. Coincidentally, 12 had paraplegia, 12 had quadriplegia. So that was nice and neat. And the main finding from that study was that, yes, they agree. There are these 2 polar stories that we see. And then as a result of that, people assume that you kind of fit in one or the other, with little recognition for the life that can live in between tragedy and overachievement. Some really amazing, or not amazing, but people would say you're either absent or amazing, you're suffering or you're a superhero, you're invisible or you're inspiring. One person said you're either home crying or you're playing basketball. So it really resonated how, there was either this one or the other. And then that kind of created a misunderstanding of what life can be really like living with spinal cord injury, but also acknowledging there's truth in the tragedy and there can be truth in the overachievement as well. But when we only see those 2 stories, then we don't realize that there is life in between. And then my third study, I interviewed journalists and their sources. And this is probably the study where I learned the most, where I came into the PhD not knowing anything about journalism. As I said, I'm a physio, but I had a supervisor who was a journalist. And so she really helped steer me in the right direction. And this project, as I said, I interviewed journalists, but I also interviewed sources. So they're the people that pitch the stories to the journalist. So that might be a university who's got a research project looking at spinal cord injury. It might be a research institute. It might be a peer agency. And they've all got their own motives of why they want to have a story about spinal cord injury in the media. And so this project, I realized that in fact, it's not always journalists who are to blame. And in fact, we could look at our own community, that being the spinal cord injury community, and recognize that in fact, that we have a role in sometimes feeding into that narrative, not on purpose, but just by nature of how news works, is that you need to have a story that hooks people in. And unfortunately, the day-to-day stories of just living aren't very exciting. So that's why we kind of see this tragedy and overachievement narrative. So that was all really good. So I applied for this travel fellowship and I was successful. And as Terry said, my initial plan was to come to Vancouver, but then having had such a great time in Vancouver and learning a lot actually around how it looks, I thought maybe I should really seize the opportunity and go somewhere that I haven't been to before. And so rather than heading to Vancouver, I went down south to Miami, to the Miami project. And to me, that really, I also think Canada and Australia are very similar. So to go to America just blew my mind because I really brought home to me what the absence of universal healthcare does in terms of shaping people's experiences. So actually, I'd be very keen to know from, I'm assuming you're all Canadian. Yeah.
Yes.
But you live very closely to the US, but yet they're two very different health systems.
Mm-hmm.
And to live so closely to that, you must know of people with spinal cord injury who are in the US, but yet they may not have the same opportunities as people in Canada. Would that be true?
Yes.
Yeah, it was, I find it really fascinating. And people here in Australia, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here in Australia, America really is everywhere in our media. We grew up all on US television shows, for example, and people look to America as being the gold standard for so many different things. Yet you look at the healthcare system and I'm skipping ahead, but I'll tell you about my time in Miami, and that's where I had this light bulb moment that really changed my thinking. So this is why I applied for the fellowship. And so where I did go, I first went to the UK. So I went to Spinal Injuries Association. They cover all of the UK. They're probably similar to the BC. Oh goodness me, what's the name of your organization, Terry?
Spinal cord injury BC. Yeah, very similar.
Yeah. They recently employed a public relations officer, which initially they thought, do we really need this? But in fact, now they've recognized the benefit of having someone who's really knowledgeable about how media works is helping them pitch their stories. So that was really interesting. Then I went over to Switzerland, to the Swiss Paraplegic Center. I mean, Switzerland's a different beast in itself in terms of money and healthcare, but they had a dedicated newsroom of 70 people employed purely looking at marketing. But their system is very different in that they, it's Switzerland, but they have this foundation that has been going for 50 years where Swiss people are encouraged to take out this insurance that if they were to sustain a spinal cord injury, it will enable them to get some extra money that they can put towards equipment or care. It's $90 a year. And it's kind of something that grandparents will give to their kids as a Christmas gift. And they have like million point something members. So they get a lot of money from this initiative, and equivalent of $90. So it's actually not much a year, but if you have over 1 million members, that's huge. So as a result, they have 4 publications a year, like newsletters that are very glossy and nice. So, and they invest a lot into their marketing. So I thought that was interesting. Then I went up to Sweden to Spinalis, and I met Anna. She's a person, she has spinal cord injury. She's a graphic designer, and she's very passionate about photography and how they will take photographs of people with spinal cord injury, and they're really conscientious about their website and their out-facing material. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Spinalis website, but even if you, they've got 3. I can pronounce spinal tips, and Mama, Papa, Lum, but I can't pronounce that first one. But they're very beautiful websites if you wanted to have a look at those. And then RG Active, they've been around for a long time. They provide outdoor and physical activity programs for people with spinal cord injury. But Gill to me is the place that just went, oh my goodness, it's in Gothenburg. So hopefully ISKOS is in Gothenburg this year. So I really hope they're going to open up opportunity for people to visit Gill, which is Gothenburg Independent Living. I have some photos to show you, but they really are very provocative in their marketing. They, for example, in their office, they have a boardroom table that's not a traditional square, it's wavy. So it brings people in when they're sitting in wheelchairs, a bit more inclusive. They had a doorway that was low. So I had to duck to get through it, but someone in a wheelchair, they're fine. And I think I've got a photo. They had a bathroom. So all their bathrooms are accessible, but one of them, if you're sitting, so for me, if I'm sitting on the toilet, I couldn't reach the toilet paper because it was mounted up high. And then it had 2 sinks, one really high, one very low. So for me to wash my hands, if you were in a chair, it was no problem because it was at the right height. So it was really, really clever way of people recognizing inequality and inaccessibility. And it was fantastic. And so from there, I went to the United to Fight Paralysis Symposium in Minneapolis, and then down to the Miami project. And it was my first time to America in a work context to really have a better understanding of what does the system look like for someone with spinal cord injury in the US. So that was over 6 weeks, and I only lost my luggage once. Oh. That was going from the UK to America. So it was just 48 hours in same clothes. But anyway, it found me. So the thing that probably came away mostly was this idea of context. You know, when we're thinking about marketing and out-facing material, and the words that we use to describe our lives and our situations, I came to realize that, in fact, if you sustained a spinal cord injury in Australia, and which I think is very similar to Canada, your experience from acute rehab community is so different to if you were in America. And it really hit home to me when I visited the rehab center in Miami. This is the place in the middle, brand new building, bells and whistles, all the equipment you could dream of in a rehab center, including like the exoskeleton, had robotics. I met a physiotherapist and she was running late, and she apologized and said, I'm really sorry, I was just in a family meeting. A 22-year-old man with quadriplegia, and his insurance only gives him 6 weeks of rehab. And I'm just going, whoa, what does hope look like for this young man? You know, and all the rooms are set up with a spare bed because family have to stay and learn how to do the care. So all of a sudden, there is more of that tragedy narrative because people don't have that opportunity to actually see what the potential can be.
Well, I think they're starting to do that here, though. They're like, my stay was a year at GF Strong, it ended up being, but now you don't hear, people are getting a paraplegic is being put into an electric wheelchair and then shoved out the door. And it's like, what? Training that
Interesting.
we had was unbelievable. I was very lucky when I broke my back in 1981.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
sad.
I think that pushed to reduce length of stays for sure.
Yeah.
But I think here in Australia, still you would identify, well, this is a realistic. So if someone, a 22-year-old with C6 quadriplegia, has the potential to be independent, but it takes a long time. And
Mhm.
so, but if you can demonstrate that that is an achievable goal, then yeah, you have that opportunity to be here. But I mean, in America, you're governed by what your insurance will
Mm.
pay for. So, and then it kind of dawned on me, it's like, oh, okay, this is, why we probably see more of those pushes towards cure and restoration that comes out of America. And I started to get a better understanding of the challenges that people must have. And yeah, and because media has no boundaries in terms of, I can jump on the internet, and if I'm Googling for something, there's no filter that stops something from America. It's what's popular. So here, and if someone, people will look at Miami Project and see the beautiful brand new building and all the equipment, and they think that's the best place to be in the world. It's like, well, hold on a moment. What you're not seeing is that, in fact, people have limited opportunity for rehab.
Yeah.
And people think the grass is kind of greener on the other side, but it's trying to then educate people around what it is that they're seeing online, and how that can inform media portrayals. So that was really significant for me. And then the other thing was then the opportunity so context was one key finding I came out, but then creatives, working with creative people. Like, I'm a creative person at heart, but I have it in my mind, but I don't have the capacity to actually physically do it. But I love the opportunity to be able to work with creative people. So have you heard of the This Is Serious Shit campaign?
No.
I'd be interested to see how it lands in it. So this came out of the UK. This is the Spinal Injuries Association, and they're the group that recently got a public relations person. And so they've really built up their marketing team. And as a result of that, they started this initiative that recognized that people with spinal cord injury weren't being optimally treated in hospital in terms of bowel management. So if someone was admitted into hospital for a secondary complication, like might be appendicitis, a heart condition, pressure area, then they weren't getting the bowel care that they needed. So they started a campaign that went all the way up to Parliament, and they thought about what's going to be their tagline, and they were really nervous about using this one because it says shit. But in fact, it's been really successful. And I think it wouldn't have happened, I don't think, without having that marketing team and strategy around how to promote such a really important issue. So I thought that was good. The photo underneath is one of the photographs taken that's on the Spinalis website. So I mentioned I met Anna. She's a person with spinal cord injury, a graphic designer and photographer. She's really passionate about creating photographs that are empowering for people with spinal cord injury. And this is just an example of one which I really like, because she finds a lot of the time the photographs are taken looking down at someone with spinal cord injury, but she liked the idea of looking up. And I think this image demonstrates how it can really change your perspective on what it means to be a wheelchair user. So that was really fantastic. And so the one on the far right is the toilet, the bathroom I was telling you about. So you can see the toilet paper is all the
Toilet
way
paper.
here.
Wow. I couldn't even reach that.
So funny. And then the two sinks. Well, which one do I use? It was so clever. And they had a pinball machine that was height adjustable. and yeah, I told you about the boardroom table and the doorway. But they also had an initiative a few years ago. They created a line of beer, and they launched that at a wine and beer event, and it was proven to be very successful. And as a result of that, they had restaurants approaching them saying, can we get your beer into our restaurant? And they said, sure, but only if you have an accessible bathroom. So they leveraged the success of the beer line to then start opening up the conversation around accessible bathrooms. And now they have a yearly award for the most attractive accessible bathroom. And this was the winner last year. So I can only imagine what the view must look like from the toilet, because it looks like there is the toilet, I think you can see, is behind, and it must have a spectacular view. And then so this was the award from 2023, yeah, so the year before. So Anders, he's the gentleman in the wheelchair, he's the head of GIL, and he's so Swedish kind of. Yeah, he has a real persona about him, a lot of attitude. And I'm going, what's your background, Anders, to be so creative in this space? And then he's an engineer or accountant by background, but he said, I know creative people. And I went, you just got to leverage on who you know. So I think that was, yeah, really inspiring. So as a result of all of that, I always had a pipe dream to turn a key finding of my thesis into an illustration, because the last thing I wanted was to do a PhD and to sit there, you know, in a library and for no one to ever read it, or to be in an academic paper and really not accessible to anyone. So fortunately, I was able to use some of the money that I had from the travel fellowship to put towards an illustration. And that was quite a process in itself, because I just didn't even really know where to start. But through word of mouth, I was connected with an illustrator, Steph Hughes, and fortunately she was available and affordable and very keen. And so we had a discussion, and then I thought, oh, how am I going to create a script that would go towards an illustration? And then I realized that, in fact, the second study of my thesis, which is interviewing people with spinal cord injury, they had already told me what their experience and story was. So I used the findings of that study to turn that into a script. And then I spoke to Steph, and in fact, Steph hadn't ever met anyone with spinal cord injury before. So she wanted some images of real life people with spinal cord injury. So I went online to find images of people, images that I thought were authentic, and I sent them to her. And we had a little back and forth, and yeah, this is what we came up with. Interestingly, because Steph didn't know anyone with spinal cord injury, initially when it came to me, most of the characters, in fact, 90% of the characters were women. And I went, oh, actually, in the spinal cord injury population, the ratio is the other way. So, yeah, that was an interesting conversation. And you know, it's obviously it's a comic strip, so it's, you know, things like backrests, height. I tried to, like, the image on the top right, both had backrests that were really high. I'm going, that just doesn't look quite right. But then obviously the image in the top row, this woman doesn't have foot plates on her power chair. So I was like, I couldn't afford to be too picky. But I also had a group of people with spinal cord injury that would look at draft copies with me, certainly with the script. First of all, the script initially had lots of words, but as we started to get the images, then we could cut a lot of the words out, because the images started to speak for themselves. Yeah, so that's where we got to. So that took a process of about 6 to 7 months, and it was, yeah, ready kind of second half of last year. And then I thought, actually, my idea was I always thought it'd be great to have something that's very easy for people to look on their phone. But the size of this, it's not that conducive when you're looking at on your phone because the font ends up being a bit small. So I thought I'll just go old school and get them printed out onto cards, because it's actually really nice when something's just sitting on a coffee table or on a desk at work and people go, oh, what's this? And then engaging with it in person rather than online. And so this has been received very well. And I've put a QR code on the back so then people can scan it and download their own copy for free. And I had a graphic designer who changed the format so it can also be printed off into an A3 copy, so like more like a poster. And a friend of mine who works at the local hospital sent me a message the other day because she saw that it had been printed off and put on one of the pinup boards on the spinal board. So, which is exactly kind of what I wanted. I just wanted something there to people to start a conversation around, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. And that last pain around, wanting people to create their own story and not feel like they have to follow a path that is what they've commonly seen in news media. And then since I've sent this out far and wide, I've had some really lovely opportunities. So obviously talking to you all has been a great opportunity. I'm doing a podcast next month that's about translation in science, which is amplifying research with Chris Parlow. The University of Melbourne, who have a physiotherapy school, the person who runs the neurological subject is going to incorporate it as a learning material. Spinal Cord Injuries Association here in Australia, they've supported it and promoting it through their networks. Just last week, the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, they're going to promote it through their social media outlets. So it's it's really lovely to see the life that it's taking. And the ABC, that's our government-funded news network here in Australia, they've approached me to see how they can use it as part of an education tool for their staff. So this quote down below is one that I received from a physiotherapist that works with kids with spinal cord injury. And he shared it with a parent of one of the primary school kids, and they thought it was just perfect. Obviously, I haven't interviewed children or parents. I've only ever worked in adults, so I feel bad. Sometimes I forget about the kids. I just go. So when I saw this, I just thought, oh, that's so lovely that it resonates with a parent of a child with spinal cord injury. So that, I was really chuffed by that.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and so these are all the people that have helped. So with the illustration, Steph Hughes was the illustrator, Lee Warren was the graphic designer, and then Campbell, Johnny, Antonio, Naz, Anna, Paul, they all were people with spinal cord injury that helped bring it together as well. Yeah, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if it resonates in the Canadian setting, what you think could be done better, or where you think it might be helpful to maybe where I could raise awareness around the illustration.
GF Strong.
That's our rehab center here. I think you might have, I don't know if you saw it, Leanne, when you were here.
Yeah, that's our big rehab section.
Yeah. I think it would be good.
Yeah, I think that when I put the illustration together, I had to really think about who am I targeting, and I actually realized I wanted to target people with mainly newly acquired spinal cord injury, because they're the ones that are coming in. Spinal cord injury happens and it's not like you're planning for it. And so people's perceptions then of what life will look like is often informed by what they've seen through media. They would rarely have had the opportunity to actually ever meet someone in person with spinal cord injury beforehand. But they're not only the person with the injury, but their friends and family, because I think from my clinical experience, but also through my research, is that it can often take a little bit longer for friends and family to adjust.
Yeah.
I was really surprised when I interviewed people with spinal cord injury who were 10, 20 years down the track, and they were telling me of if something crops up on Facebook or on news media, straight away they're getting a message to say, oh, have you seen this story of a cure that's available in China? It's like,
Yeah.
you've been living with spinal cord injury for 20 years. You're married with kids.
Or 44 years.
Yeah, that still happens.
Yes.
And that's okay. It's like people don't do it maliciously.
No.
It comes from a place of wanting to help. And I think we could all in society do a better job at recognizing the different lives we can live and looking at the opportunities. And yeah.
The other thing that came to me, Leanne, that I think would be really beneficial is even with spinal cord injury organizations or disability organizations in itself, their communications department. Because oftentimes they're like able-bodied people that that may be working with people with disability, but don't really truly understand how it all works, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that might be another sort of target.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, yeah. And as you were saying that, oh, I forgot to mention that a friend of mine is a videographer, filmmaker, and she's turned the illustration into an animation.
Oh, how cool.
Because we were looking at different ways of how it can be translated, and that's going to solve the issue. It goes for 1 minute and 15 seconds, so not too long. And I got people with spinal cord injury to be the voices. And it was just finished yesterday, but I think it involves a couple of tweaks, so it's not quite ready to share today. But I think that will possibly be a bit more, another way for people to engage in it, because not everyone's going to sit and want to look at that.
So cool. Congratulations. That's really
But that's really a good point, Terry. Yeah, fully. Yeah, it's interesting, there's always going to be turnover of staff. You're going to have new staff. What's their perceptions of disability and spinal cord injury? What are their previous experiences? And that can inform their language. A simple one is even talking to some physios around, people will commonly say that they're suffering from a spinal cord injury. They're suffering with spinal, and it's like, well, what other word are we going to use? And I go, well, you could just say the person has a spinal cord injury. And it's like, oh, it's not for me to say whether someone's suffering or not. They might be, but it shouldn't be the go-to word when talking about it.
Yeah. Well, I think it stems back to when I was first injured, he broke his neck. I didn't really break my neck. I fractured a vertebrae in my neck that cut my spinal cord. But I think that was back when Debbie was injured as well. It's been a long time, and that narrative was used for so long. What happened to him? He broke his neck. She broke his neck. That came right from the medical institution. Like, oh, he's broken neck. So I think that might lend to he's got to be suffering. Well, yeah, for the first few weeks I was, but after that I was okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somebody at my work years ago, when I was an able-body, I remember him saying, oh, my cousin broke his back and they're paralyzed. And I thought, oh, no, not paralyzed, just broke their back. But I just assumed they would get fixed and get like any other broken piece of our body. Heal and up you go. Never dreamt this stuff.
Debbie, that's something that someone mentioned to me about, fractured vertebrae. Oh, well, fractures, they just get better, and then you're fine.
Who knew it'd affect the bowels and the bladder and oh my God.
I've recently started using fractured vertebrae. I damaged my spinal cord just to, but they still don't know what a damaged spinal cord is, but it's sure a lot better than broken neck.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a dislocation, so I always say, "Oh, I had a 90-degree dislocation," which is true, and
Yeah. Yeah.
dislocation. But what I realize is when I'm talking to kids, especially, like, so I used to always use the analogy that the spinal cord is like a telephone wire that
Yeah.
your brain is talking to your body
Mhm.
and is relaying signals back and forth. But I realize that kids don't understand what telephone wires
Oh.
are. So I gotta
Yeah.
change it. A communication device. I don't know. Like, how do you describe it to kids, right?
Yeah.
Cell
Yeah.
phone to a cell tower.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah.
That's
That-
great.
That reminds me of when I was well, I looked after my grandson, and I think he was 4 years old. And I thought he went to the bathroom. So what's he doing? So I go down there, and I have a picture, but I can't bring it up. But all toilet papers all over the floor, and he's unrolling this thing, and he's moving his hands around. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I thought I'd do some magic to see if you can walk so we could go into the forest." Because I said, "I wished I could walk and take you to the forest and we could go through there and find all kind of goodie in the forest." And he was trying to heal me
Oh,
Oh my
with his
goodness.
magic toilet paper, I guess.
oh.
It's so cute.
And I still got the picture. It's so funny when I see that one.
Uh,
Well,
great.
Leanne, when you were talking earlier, I can always have so many conversations with you because it always like gets me thinking. So it's kind of one of my theories that I had a while ago, but I think you've kind of proven it with doing this, which is great. So whenever I used to go to conferences in the States,
Mhm.
right? Like it's so very different. Like it's very cure focused, and people are like you mentioned, right? So it's like people are like living to walk again. And it's
Yes.
so interesting because in different countries, they're like, well, we just want to fix our hands or our bowels or our bladder, right? Like, walking is like last on the list, right?
Yeah.
And I totally think it is because of the length of stay, right? Because they haven't actually learned how to be independently living
Yeah.
as a person living in a wheelchair. Then that's what their answer is, right? Because that's what we all knew, right? That was what I first knew when I got injured was, okay, I'm just got to walk again, right? And
Yeah.
then you're like, oh wait, but actually walking, I don't really care because to be honest with you, if I stand, that means now I have to transfer onto a toilet. Like all of these other things actually are really harder for me. But
And,
or
and
actually,
scary.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You gotta like go through all the rehab. Anyways, but it's really interesting, and it kind of like so here I'm in Mexico right now, and there's a quad here. Had a spinal cord injury 13 years ago. He's from the States, originally from Bulgaria, and moved to the States to San Francisco 15 years ago, and had his injury shortly after he moved to San Francisco. And his his wife, so he doesn't have any didn't well he had insurance but is on like state insurance, whatever, so the Medicaid, Medicare, and he cannot work, right? Like he says basically what they do is they support him. He has a wheelchair. I mean, it's kind of similar for us as well. So he got 6 weeks of rehab. He's C5. He actually does pretty good. Is in a manual chair and is pretty fit and is wheeling around. But his wife is his full-time caregiver, and he honestly, like, when he was talking to us, he was sharing things like, I think I just kind of want to, I don't know if it's better for me just to leave. I want my wife to have a life, and I want, my son to have a life, and I feel like they're tied down by me and this and that. And, we're trying to tell them, well, get out, like, there's peer social groups, right? Like, there's so much you can be doing, and so much for your wife doing, but that it's always that fear of losing, what you're funding to go back to
Right.
work and start being involved in the community or doing things. So we're just like, volunteer your time and see how it works. I don't know, it's really tricky, but it was really,
One of the counselors that came to the GF Strong, when, you know, we had counselors that come and talk to us from spinal cord injury. And the first thing she said, she was a walking paraplegic. And she said, I just want you to know, you could do anything and everything you did before, only from a wheelchair. That was the best advice I got.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think back to the gentleman that you're referring to from Bulgaria. I think a lot of times, and it's crossed my mind too, is we get a little bit insecure. Get a
Mhm.
little insecure ourselves and say, okay, well, you know, and you start almost second guessing your whole existence and your current situation. And I think that happens to a lot of people. And but yeah, you're right. He's in a predicament where stay at home and do nothing and not be engaged, opposed to, you know, losing that funding and be more engaged. However, as we know, working is not easy when you got a bowel routine every second day, and it's so there. Yeah, it's definitely. I can see where one side where he's coming from, and on the other side, I can see also have experienced that insecurity and that doubt. So kind of a fine line to walk there some days.
Yeah.
One of the when I spoke to journalists and sources, so that project where I looked like there's just a cycle of practices in terms of what's people's motivation to try and get a story into mainstream news, and then you need the hook, and you're competing against so many other stories that it's understandable why we see the stories that we do. And now I'm working in now I do research full time, and I'm looking at healthcare communication and people going online seeking unproven therapies, not just for spinal cord injury, but for multiple different conditions, which often comes down to people's hopes in health and opportunity. But what can be those underpinning motives? In disability and spinal cord injury, it could be the fear of an unknown of what life can look like living with spinal cord injury that might be informing that behavior, which can be different to someone who might have more of a life-limiting illness like motor neuron disease or cancer. So I'm looking at that as well. But part of kind of appreciating that, in fact, if we can't change news media portrayals so much, I think some of the wording could definitely improve. But I think as us as a community, we need to look at how it is that we can put more stories out there that fill that void between the Paralympics and cure. And I think social media platforms, you know, most agencies now have that. And I think it's definitely better than what it used to be. But how it is that we can counter the stories that currently exist. So that was part of another motivation to try and put this together, is for us to think collectively. And Rod, so what you're talking about, you know, and Terry with this gentleman, is if in fact he could see the other stories and opportunities, and which is what peer support does, you know, it all comes back to peer support, you know, that opportunity for people to meet people early on and discover that in fact, I even love the simple thing of having someone who's lived with spinal cord injury come onto acute ward and not be wearing a hospital gown, you know, dressed nicely, and seeing that, okay, I can dress nicely and be using a wheelchair. You know, that people don't often see that through media, you know. Yeah. And in America, I just don't think there is. It's a whole different place.
Yeah, because a lot of the media, when somebody famous or something's broken their neck or back, you know, they make it sound like, oh, they'll get better. And I think, no, you're not telling the truth. This person's not going to get better fast. You know, they got a long process ahead of themselves.
Well, especially somebody like Christopher Reeves.
Yes, yeah.
You know, you really brought the spinal cord injury basically to the forefront. But
yes,
I was just going to ask you if you were aware of that horrific bus crash that happened in 2018. Hockey players. I mean, that sort of
Yeah.
really threw
Right.
spinal cord injuries into the forefront, because there was 12 of them that sustained
How
spinal
most
cord
Saskatchewan.
injuries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When
Oh,
did this
and,
happen, Gordon?
I
recently.
think it was 2018, I think.
Oh.
Five,
It was
6 years
just
ago.
yeah, just before COVID.
Wow.
Oh,
And,
But
but I mean, there again, the media immediately jumped on this,
Sure.
sending them all to China to
Yeah.
to have this stem cell
yes.
transplants and stuff like that in order to get them back walking, things like that.
Right.
And because it's not sanctioned in Canada, so
Right.
therefore you have to go somewhere else for treatment like that.
well, sure, and there you go. There's the whole concept in a nutshell. If it's not sexy, if it's not Christopher Reeves or a hockey team bus crash,
Right.
the media is not going to give it a look, or give it a honest, thorough look. And
That's right.
that
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm way off base here, but is there maybe a role for government, municipal or not municipal, but provincial governments, maybe to do a better job in promoting? I know because in BC we get a lot of funding, and home health care is funded, and it's a disaster, along with a couple other things. But would there be a role for government to be using this medium?
As in government looking at how they market or how they communicate,
Well-
or whether there's role for policy in trying to shift media portrayals.
Yes, that could be the latter. Yeah.
There is a I don't know what's in Canada, and I can email it to you, Terry. Griffiths University, together with Media Diversity Australia, created a document looking at it's like a reporting guideline for disability more broadly. And what's really unique about it, it looks at the intersection of experiences. So people with spinal cord injury or disability could also identify as LGBTQI, for example. It can also come from different cultures, could be First Nations. And so there's a lot of sensitivities around language for all minority groups or groups that may have traditionally been stigmatized. So none of us are one of those things in isolation. And so this document really approaches it in a nice way that I think helps people think about or how it is that you might talk or report. So going back to it, even you're saying, Terry, people who work in different agencies, I think it's a really wonderful, it should be part of a onboarding that they have a look. So I'll send it to you. But Rod, yeah, I think interestingly though, with guidelines, going and talk to journalists, is that they would rarely look at them. The only one that's really proven to be successful is the reporting of suicide. That's proven to be quite effective. But any other initiatives to introduce a guideline in journalism reporting hasn't really gained much traction. There's greater incentive for people to think about language when they have actually had a personal experience. And I saw that with journalists who kindly shared when they've had experience with cancer, either themselves or family member or friends, where you often see the fight against cancer, the person lost the battle with cancer, but yet they didn't personally feel that they didn't lose. And so because of that incentive, because they had that relationship, then they thought about the language. So unless someone then knows someone with spinal cord injury and disability, it just tends to, what are the words that come to mind and how we can do it. So I don't think that necessarily answered your question, Rod, but I think government, across all agencies, we just need to do better.
In 2020, we worked on a document for government and for provinces called the Health Standards, and this was presented to the federal government. But if the federal government doesn't want to sort of make it part of the health ministries in each province, then it sort of dies on the grapevine. So we do all this work of of getting the specialists involved and the healthcare organizations involved, including Spinal Cord Injury BC, and but unless the government takes it seriously, it really doesn't help them.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it's small potatoes to them overall too, so they're not gonna, yeah, I can,
Yeah.
small potatoes to them, not to us.
Gordon,
No,
when
it
you
was-
mentioned sorry, Terry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Leanne.
I was just gonna say, Gordon, when you mentioned Christopher Reeve, I saw a documentary last year on him. Has that been in Canada?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
Oh, it has? It is?
Yeah,
Before?
yeah.
Oh, I didn't
It's-
think they released it.
Using archival footage of his life with interviews with his kids, and I thought there was going to be more discussion around kind of the tension that existed around his advocacy in stem cell research in America. It's touched on a little bit, but it made me aware around, his advocacy in that space was the mindset of, well, if we're going to help people with disability, we have to cure them. That was kind of his approach. And I've thought, oh, now I get it. Having been to America, I kind of get it that that's their approach. But that caused a lot of tension within the disability community, because there are those who are living with disability and living well with disability found that to be offensive, that needed to be cured.
I agree.
And fixed. And so it was Dana Reeves that read the room and thought, hold on a moment, we can't invest all this money just into research. There are some people that don't have means of transport, they don't have care. So it was her that then said, we need to distribute the funds across the board and be doing both.
Yes.
And I just didn't even know the role that Dana Reeves had in all of that. So I thought, wow, good on her.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's worldwide. Whether you be in the United States or Canada or probably Australia, I mean, there's more money poured into research,
Yes.
than what is generally distributed throughout the actual
Patient
spinal
care.
cord injury
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
I agree, Gordon. Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
point.
Hey, Gord, if you have where we can watch it.
I watched it on CBC. Now, whether it's still on CBC Gem or not, I don't know.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
But it was broadcast under CBC Docs.
Recently? Is that recently, Gordon?
No, this would probably be during COVID, I guess. So probably
Oh, wow,
4
that
or 5
long.
years ago.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was part of our International Film Festival last year, and I suspect it was kind of doing this festival circuit the year before, maybe. But I can't remember the name of the film.
I don't remember the name
I want to
of
say
it.
Man of Steel or something like that, but actually, Terry, when I email you the link to that guideline document, I'll find the movie and I'll email that to you as well.
Okay, well, it's 5 o'clock my time / 9 o'clock
2 p.m. here.
all the time zones.
Very good.
Leanne, I just want to thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Leanne.
No,
just think you're just such an amazing example of translational research, actually doing research that we see and we can use, and
Practical.
it's in our hands, which is just so rare,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So thank you.
thank you. No, really lovely opportunity. And when I was at the gym this morning, I said, "Oh, I've got a meeting. I'm talking to some Canadians," and they go, "What?" So, thank you so much. And
The World Wide Web is an amazing place. It really
Yes.
is.
100%.
yeah,
Okay.
great. All right, we'll stay
Thank you
in
so
touch.
much.